Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This is episode number 36 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Thank you so much for being a part of the program today, for tuning in and listening wherever podcasts are found. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and of course at sportspectrum.com, where all of our content lives, including daily articles that are written by myself and a wonderful staff that we work with here at Sports Spectrum. We also put out a daily devotional each morning during the week. It literally takes maybe 2 to 3 minutes to read. It has some scripture, a little story of reflection and comparison, or something relevant to the sports world, and intersecting that with something into the faith world, or even just straight up from the Word of God in the Gospels or in the Bible. So really cool stuff there. Check it out, sportspectrum.com. And as always, you can subscribe right on the webpage and become a member of Sports Spectrum for just $36 for an entire year. That equals to $3 a month, which is peanuts in a lot of ways. So $36 for a membership to become a member of Sports Spectrum. Partner with us. You get our quarterly magazine. And by the way, our new magazine is coming out in just a couple weeks, second week of September. It's our football preview issue where myself and others give predictions on the upcoming NFL season. We also have an amazing story in there about the 50-yard line huddle that NFL players and even college players and high school players too, that 50-yard line prayer huddle that you see at the end of every game. We talk about the origins of that, the reasoning behind that, why players go to the 50 to pray. And it's just such a cool article and an awesome cover of one of those 50-yard line huddles that you may have seen last year in an NFL game. So highly recommend the magazine. It is a high quality content with new staff that we just brought on to Sports Spectrum that we're designing it. So there's just some really cool things happening. And in order to get that magazine, you can subscribe. It's, like I said, $36 for an entire year, and you get our magazine. You get all the content from 30 years of history at Sports Spectrum, all available at sportspectrum.com. And you also help produce and fund and keep this podcast going, because we provide that to you for free, of course. And we want to continue to do that. But your generous sort of subscription or membership or partnering with us, however you want to word it, helps to fund all this and keep us providing these stories, these inspirational stories for you on the podcast. So consider doing that, sportspectrum.com. Today's guest. Now, this is a little bit of a different guest than we've had on before. It's not somebody who's as affiliated in sports as you might think. But when I found out that he was available for a podcast, I really wanted to have him on. I just think he's an interesting guy with a pretty amazing story. His name is Lee Strobel, and he is the author of the book, The Case for Christ. Now, that title might sound familiar to you because recently, there was a movie that came out called The Case for Christ. It came out last April of 2017, and it's just now being released on, video, DVD, iTunes, Google Play, Blu-ray, all of that. So that movie, The Case for Christ, is out, and it's based on the life of Lee Strobel. Now, Lee is an author of 20 books, so he's more than 20 books. So he's written on things other than just The Case for Christ, but he's also a teaching pastor at Woodlands Church down in Houston. And we do talk to him about Houston and the effects of the hurricane down there and all that happened and kind of a little bit of the aftermath of that and kind of how everything's going with Lee down there. Everything seems to be going well. But we'll talk to him about that as well. But he is a guy who has a journalism background. So I can relate to him in that sense. And he was an atheist. And he decided, you know what? Because his wife had become a Christian, he wanted to know more about Christianity, more about the resurrection of Jesus, if this is true. So he took 2 years and investigated and made a case for Jesus Christ. Was it real? Did it happen? And his findings are as convincing as you'll ever find someone, especially going from the skeptic world of not believing to the evangelical world or Christian world of truly believing in what Jesus who Jesus is and what Jesus stood for and what he did and coming to this world as the Son of God. So really interesting story here, interesting interview. And there is some sports sprinkled in. So Lee has an amazing story about an interaction he had with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, one of the NBA's all-time great players. And certainly Lee is a diehard Chicago Cubs fan, and we'll talk a lot about the Cubs, and he has a great story with them as well. So look forward to you hearing this interview. This is episode number 36, and our guest is the Case for Christ, the author of that book. His name, here he is, Lee Strobel. Lee, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to have you here on the podcast. And before we get started, I have so much I want to talk to you about, and your story is just amazing. And obviously the new movie that's recently been released about your life. But I want to just talk because you are based in Houston, and we're taping this at the end of August, running this first week of September 2017. And I just want to ask you, how are things where you are? I've been following you on Twitter, and seeing the amount of rain that you've gotten has just been incredible, and obviously all the devastation that's taken place down there. Just how are you, and how is your surrounding area of where you are?
Well, thanks for asking. You know, the hurricane was a real blow to South Texas and to the Houston area, record-setting, unprecedented flooding throughout our area. I think in my house, my rain gauge, which is accommodates 7 inches of rain, kept overflowing. So I never came up with a perfect figure in terms of the amount of rain, but based on how much it overflowed and so forth, I would think we got well over 30 inches here at our house. And we had a little bit of flooding issue, but not too bad. The rest of the city, though, had some significant problems, thousands of people in shelters. It's going to take years really to recover from a lot of the devastation, especially along the coast. So this was a huge disaster for the entire Houston area, which, you know, a lot of people don't realize. Houston is the fourth largest city in America, and geographically it's a huge, huge city. So to have that kind of devastation as widespread as it is, with the kind of impact on that many people, is really profound.
Yeah, it's been kind of, I felt helpless watching it from up here. I live in Connecticut, and, you know, we've had, I feel guilty almost to say this, but we've had beautiful weather. It's been very unusual weather for late August here in Connecticut, 75, sunny, and you just feel so guilty in some ways, and you feel so helpless being up here watching what's happening down there. But many people have been really rallying around, I know, and just from your perspective, you know, times of crisis kind of bring out the best of us, I think. Would you agree with that, and just what you've seen?
Yeah, they really do, especially here in Texas. You know, Texas spirit. You know, you can't really knock down Texans in terms of, you know, somebody's going to help you back up. Our church, Woodlands Church, has been very involved with the relief efforts and disaster efforts. Samaritan's Purse has been involved. In fact, if people want to give to an organization that's doing a lot to help people here in Texas, Samaritan's Purse would be a good one to choose. So it does bring out the best in people, and it brings out the best in Christians and churches. A lot of churches open their doors to be sites for, you know, flood refugees, so to speak, people who have lost their homes or flooded out temporarily. And you see the churches rallying around. I know during the flooding we had in the past couple of years, our church worked with Samaritan's Purse. We sent a lot of teams down into the city to help clear brush and to renovate homes and so forth. So it gives us an opportunity to serve and to point people toward the one who motivates us to do that.
Amen. I agree. And thank you for sharing that. And we'll definitely be continuing to pray for everyone affected down there, as well as the first responders and people. I'm sure what's going to happen over the next few months and even weeks is people coming from all over the United States and the world. I know this will happen because this is what we do. We have that spirit of coming down and aiding and helping in whatever way possible. So we'll continue to pray for everything that's happening down there, and for you and your congregation as well, Lee.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now let's talk. We're having you on. We had this podcast sort of booked a few weeks ago. So one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on is to talk about the movie, the Case for Christ movie. It was released in April and is now available digitally on iTunes and Google Play and DVD and Blu-ray and all that. And I've seen it now twice. I watched it a couple days ago just to kind of prepare for this interview. And I watched it when it first came out in April. And it's a fantastic movie. It's really great. And I can't encourage our listeners enough to go see this movie. It's just awesome. I tweeted about it the other day. It's just fantastic. But And we're going to talk about your story in a moment, like sort of what the movie is based on. But
Sure.
what was it like seeing yourself portrayed on the big screen? It had to be a little strange, I would think, right?
Yeah, well, a little embarrassing because, I'm not proud of my behavior before I was a Christian. I was a very heavy drinking, narcissistic, self-absorbed, self-destructive, immoral living atheist at the Chicago Tribune.
Mm.
And, we portray that. And when we decided to do the movie, we said, we got to be honest. We can't pull our punches because if we did that, then people would see through that and lose credit. The film would lose credibility. So, I'm not proud of what I was like in those days. I'm thankful God changed my life and my character and my values and so forth. But seeing it was difficult a bit. They sent us a link so we could watch it before it released in movie theaters. And my wife watched it 10 times. And I asked her, why do you keep watching it? And she said, I'm trying to get cried out so that when I see it in public, I won't cry and embarrass myself. Although when it showed in public, she still cried, and so did I. I mean, it's an emotional film from our perspective. And the funny thing is, just last night we rented it on our local cable station, has it available, and we watched it again. And I still got tears during several parts, just because just grateful for God changing our family. And I think of our family today and where we're at, and my son, a professor of theology, my daughter, a novelist who writes Christian novels, my granddaughter, Abigail, just at age 12, going on mission trips and leading people to Christ. So God has really healed our family in a remarkable way. And as I watch the film, I think, it could have gone another way. And I'm grateful God rescued us.
It's pretty interesting, though, when you think, because I'm in the process of writing a book myself, and it's about what you say, in your life, it's about things I'm not proud of, but I think when we're vulnerable and when we share those, we're not sharing those to sort of toot our own horn. We're sharing those so we can encourage others that there is hope and that there is a possibility to not be stuck in that. I would assume that was your intention in the whole idea of having to be as transparent and vulnerable as possible with the struggles you had.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see others as being unlikely candidates for conversion, and they look at their lives and say, well, there's no way so-and-so is ever going to come to faith. That's what people said about me, and I think a movie like this helps people see that, what, God still rescues people. He still can take the most unlikely candidates for conversion and bring them to faith. In fact, since we're doing a sports program, one of the remarkable stories that I encountered was Evel Knievel, the motorcycle daredevilist who was in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most broken bones of any human being. I became famous for jumping motorcycles over cars and trucks and Snake River valleys and things. And, he was a hard-drinking gambler, womanizer, once beat up a business associate with a baseball bat, ended up in jail over that. Just so he lived a difficult, a really immoral life in a lot of ways. And yet, in his later years, he was on the beach in Florida, and he heard God speak to him. And God said to him, and he felt this on the inside, he said, Robert, I've saved you more times than you'll ever know. Now I need you to come to me through my son, Jesus. And he felt this, and he thought, well, I don't even know who Jesus is. So he called Frank Difford, who was the sportscaster, who was the only Christian he knew, and he said, Frank, I just had this experience. I don't know what to do with it. Who's Jesus? And Frank said, well, get the Case for Christ and read that. So he got my book, Case for Christ. Anyway, long story short, Evel Knievel had the most radical transformation and born-again experience of anybody I ever encountered. I mean, he was radically born again. When he was baptized, he told his testimony and pleaded with people to come to faith, and 700 people came to faith at his baptism. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
And when he died a few years later, he had engraved on his tomb, "Believe in Jesus." Now, here was a guy that nobody thought would ever come to faith. And yet, you know what? His daughter, who was a Christian, had her church praying for him for 20 years. And he was a guy that was easy to give up on, and I was a guy easy to give up on. But we're the kind of guys who God loves to to change, and then to say to the world, look what I can still do.
Absolutely. We're talking to Lee Strobel here. He is the author and the featured person in the movie The Case for Christ, and the author of the book The Case for Christ, of course. And Lee, let's talk about your story for a moment, because for those who haven't seen the movie or haven't read your books, and I know a lot of people have heard of you, but they may not know your full story. So let's go back. It's 1978, 79, early 80s. And,
Right.
the time that's depicted in the movie, and you were just starting your journalism career in Chicago. I worked in journalism. I worked at ESPN for 17 years, so I know that sort of journalism world a little bit.
Right.
What was that time like for you, back then, personally and professionally, before, you decided to do this investigation into the whether God was real?
Well, it was a very exciting time. I got my degree from Yale Law School, a master's degree. I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. I was doing a lot of major stories, a lot of major investigations. Wrote my first book. I've been doing television and radio in Chicago. It's a very heady time, very exciting time. But I was all in with my career, to the exclusion of my family and so forth. I was a happy drunk. I enjoyed drinking, and my release, my hobby, and but I was an atheist, a skeptic. My wife was agnostic. Just didn't. I call her agnostic. I'm not sure, how to really describe her. She had some vague belief in God, but didn't know how everything fit together. So she was sort of spiritually confused. And so one day we met a woman who was a neighbor, who was a Christian nurse. In the movie, her name was Alfie. In real life, her name was Linda. And she became best friends with Leslie and shared Jesus with her, brought her to church, talked to her about the gospel, and ended up leading her to faith. And the scene in the movie where Leslie tells me she'd come to faith, it's so right on. Because I just freaked out. I thought this was the end of our marriage. First word that went through my mind was divorce. I would just look to the horizon of our marriage and see conflict over how to raise our children, how to spend our money, how to spend our weekends. I thought this was the demise of our relationship, and I was going to walk out. But I stuck around, and it was the positive changes in her character and values that sort of drew me toward the faith, while at the same time, this fear and this sense that, there was now another man in our relationship, this Jesus. I didn't invite him into our relationship. Who's this guy? That bothered me, and the more she would pursue a life of devotion to God, it was as if she was holding up a mirror, and I was seeing in contrast my life, which was corroded with corruption and sin, and it made me angry. I didn't want to face that, and so I had a lot of anger. So I had a lot of emotions going on, and I thought, if I could disprove this Christianity, I could certainly get her out of this cult that she's involved in. So that's what launched me on a nearly 2-year investigation of the historical evidence, focused largely on the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, and that's what I think has captivated all of us, to, especially for me as a guy who has done stories and worked and produced a lot of different content. You take me through that process for you, and I know the movie depicts this pretty well, about the idea of just investigating whether or not Jesus and the resurrection occurred, and the existence of God and all of that. Just take me through the process of investigating. Were you approaching it like you would any kind of investigative story, or was it something different? Were you literally out to disprove this? Because we're
Well,
supposed to be coming from a journalist perspective, right down the middle. We're not supposed to be biased on any side. So take me through that.
My hope was I would disprove it, but I was trained in the old school of journalism, University of Missouri Journalism School, which is you tell both sides, you call a ball, and a strike.
Yep.
And so I thought, I'm going to be fair. I'm going to be accurate. I'm going to look at both sides. I'm not going to load the deck one way or the other. I'm hoping I can disprove it. But and I thought that I would. My goodness, dead people do not come back to life. So it's a pretty much of a no-brainer that this is not true. So I began to investigate it. And of course, I did it as I would any story for the Chicago Tribune. I would pursue sources and study ancient history and archaeology, pursue experts in theology and New Testament and ancient history and so forth. And it was amazing to me that the evidence was as robust as it was. I mean, when you look at the fact that Jesus' death is according to atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann, indisputable that Jesus was dead when he was crucified. Secondly, we have an early report of his resurrection that dates back so immediately after his death that it can't be a legend. In fact, it's been dated back by scholars to within months of his death. Third, we have the empty tomb that even the opponents of Jesus implicitly conceded was empty. And then we've got 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. So we've got an avalanche of historical data that points powerfully and persuasively toward the truth of Christianity, which is, and Christianity invites this. It's a investigatable faith. It encourages investigation. The Apostle Paul said, look, if this isn't true, you're fully justified in walking away. So it challenges people to put it to the test, and that's what I did. And looking at the evidence, finally, I mean, I just stepped back and said, in light of the avalanche of evidence that points so powerfully toward the truth of Christianity, it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. In other words, on November the 8th of 1981, where at 2 in the afternoon, the scales just tipped decisively in favor of Christianity being true.
And the movie depicts that moment pretty great when you're talking to your wife as you come home and you're telling her, I believe. And what take us through that moment and telling your wife, because I think, that's something that also through the movie, and it depicts this well, your wife is struggling here because she has this faith and you don't. And she's praying, please just come to faith. Don't you see this? And suddenly you come to her and tell her you do.
Yeah, it was a very difficult era for Leslie. 2 years that we were unequally yoked, where I was the atheist and she was a Christian, because she felt like she was, having these incredible spiritual experiences of getting to know God and learning so much, and it was like she was on this incredible journey to exotic places like Paris and Indonesia or wherever, Singapore, and she couldn't take me along. She couldn't explain it to me. I couldn't see it. And so that was very frustrating for her. And the verse that she prayed for me at the encouragement of her spiritual mentor was Ezekiel 36:26, that says, moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And so for 2 years, she prayed that verse for me. And then God answered that prayer on November the 8th of 1981. And I remember when I told her, she threw her arms around my neck and she said, I almost gave up on you 1,000 times. She said she was just so overwhelmed by God's grace and the fact that she'd gone through that 2-year era of turbulence in our marriage, and now God had answered this long shot of a prayer that an unlikely candidate like me would come to faith.
Lee, there's a lot of our listeners, I know this, and I was kind of one of them, where there's marriages happening or relationships happening where one person is a believer and the other isn't, and it's a difficult time to walk. It's hard for families, who don't believe, with people who do, and there's a lot of strain on these relationships, and I saw that, and certainly with your relationship with your wife during those 2 years. What type of encouragement would you give to our listeners who are struggling in a relationship, whether it's a marriage or a family member, and there's this division because of faith in Christ?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because you're right. There's a lot of it out there. And so Leslie and I wrote a book called Spiritual Mismatch. What do you do when someone you love, when your spouse is not a Christian? And we included a 30-day prayer guide that we wrote and a lot of advice on what to do. I'll give you 3 quick bits of advice for people if you're in that position. Okay. Number 1, build a relationship with your spouse. In other words, you got married for a reason, and you love that person for a reason, and you like to do things together. Don't let the spiritual mismatch fling your marriage apart. Knit it together through building on those things that you hold in common, whatever hobbies or things you like to do together, keep doing those, number one. Number two, build your relationship with a mentor. Find someone like Alfie in the movie, Leslie's friend, who is a more mature Christian, who can give advice, who can be a shoulder to cry on, who can be a prayer partner, who can help you grow spiritually. Someone of the same gender, that's important. But that can be vitally important. And the third relationship is to build your relationship with God, because ultimately He is the one who's going to change your values, your character, your morality in a way that ultimately your spouse is probably going to find attractive and winsome, as I did with Leslie.
That's really great. We're talking to Lee Strobel here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And yes, we are a sports podcast. So, Lee, I want to talk to you a little bit about sports. I know you're a big sports fan. And certainly in Chicago, in the days of working at the Tribune, I imagine you have some stories for us about the Cubs and about some of the greats that played there. So let's start with Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub himself, the late Ernie Banks. I understand you have a pretty great story to share about him.
I do. Our family moved to Chicago from Germany in 1913 and have been Cubs fans all these generations. And in the early 1950s, the Cubs got a new shortstop named Ernie Banks, at the time a shortstop, and I was about 2 years old. And my dad took me to a banquet where Ernie was going to be the speaker as this new rookie Chicago Cub. So we're at this banquet, and it's the time of the meal, and people are eating before Ernie gives a talk. And I'm 2 years old. I'm toddling around. I'm walking around the room, and I fell down behind Ernie Banks' chair. So Ernie Banks reaches down, picks me up, puts me in his lap, and I sat in Ernie Banks' lap for the entire event. And then at the end, before he handed me back to my parents, Ernie Banks kissed me on the cheek.
I have to imagine he's your favorite player of all time now.
I mean, I have been kissed by Ernie Banks. How could I not be a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan? It's like I gotta be.
Absolutely. That's sealed forever, right?
It's sealed forever. And so of course all the Cubs people joke about the Cubs, and they for so many years were the hapless Cubs and went through 69 and that whole experience, coming so close and so forth. And so I'm writing my book, The Case for Christ, and I went down to Denver to interview a scholar by the name of Craig Blomberg, who's a New Testament expert. And as I'm interviewing him, he mentions that he's a big Chicago Cubs fan. So in my book, and the book is published in 1998, in the book I said, there's only one reason I have to possibly question the judgment of Dr. Blomberg, and that is that he believes that in his lifetime the Chicago Cubs are going to win the World Series. And I said, anybody who believes that, has got credibility problems. Because I thought, there's no way the Cubs are going to win the World Series in my lifetime or his lifetime. It's just not going to happen. And then, of course, they did. So I had to go back and edit all the books. I mean, we had to do a new print run and fix that reference because now it's totally outdated. But it was, grateful to do it, glad to do it in light of what the Cubs accomplished.
Well, the old saying around here, and I live in Connecticut, but big sports guy and worked at ESPN was, there is a God because the Cubs won the World Series. That was the joke, right?
That's exactly right. I was speaking at a fundraiser for a university, Olivet Nazarene University, out in Phoenix. They were doing this fundraiser, and I said I'd help them out. So I'm speaking, and Ben Zobrist comes out, because he graduated from Olivet.
Yes.
And so he gets up and he gives a little talk, and he was great. I've never met Ben, and so then as he's walking out, he stops at my table. He says, Lee Strobel. He says, oh my gosh, I'm such a huge fan. It's such an honor to meet you. I'm thinking, holy cow, this is Ben Zobrist. I was like fanboy, It was just hilarious.
And Ben Zobrist is a strong believer, obviously, and loves the Lord. So I'm a big fan of Ben's as well. We're talking to Lee Strobel here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, and Lee also a big NBA fan, from what I've heard, and certainly, living in different places in Chicago where the Bulls are, and Michael Jordan, and all those many great years there, and now you're in Houston with the Rockets. So tell me about your love for the NBA, and I hear a story that might include one of the all-time great NBA players.
Yeah, oh, I'm a huge NBA fan. I love it. I'm a big fan of John Havlicek, number 17 from the Celtics, way
Sure.
back from when. And when I was out in California, living out there, I got a phone call one day from this woman. She says, "Hey, I read your book, Case for Christ." I said, "Oh, that's great." She said, "Well, you have to know I'm Jewish." I said, "Well, that's fine." She said, "Yeah, I came to faith in Jesus through your book." I said, "Well, it's terrific." She said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm wondering, would you come over and share Jesus with my boyfriend?" I said, "Well, sure. Who's your boyfriend?" She said, "Well, you got to know something." I said, "What?" She said, "He's a Muslim." And I said, "Well, that's fine. I love Muslims. I'd love to chat with them." And she said, "Well, you got to know one other thing." I said, "What?" She said, "He's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar." So I thought,
Kareem
oh my,
Abdul-Jabbar.
I mean, I'm this huge NBA fan, thinking, "Oh my gosh, how was it?" So I got a friend. We went over to her apartment where we're going to have lunch together with Kareem, and I couldn't knock on the door. I was so nervous. I mean, this is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the number one, scorer in the history of the NBA.
Yeah.
And so we knock on the door. Kareem opens the door. We ended up having a terrific afternoon together, talking about Jesus, talking about faith. He's just like such a great guy, very smart and very informed about his faith. And then invited him over to our house. We had a great cookout at my house. I brought over Viggo Olsen, who was a Christian missionary to Bangladesh for 33 years and an expert on Islam. Had a great conversation. And several other meetings, and they really developed a bit of a relationship there where we could talk about spiritual matters. And what I loved about that relationship is, there was never any conflict. There was never any. Here we have people from two very different worldviews, very different viewpoints, each talking about why we believe what we believe. And I hope I planted some seeds there, and those might someday come to fruition. But I continue to pray for Kareem. I know he's had some health issues in recent years, and but he's a guy who's a lot like I was, an unlikely candidate for Christian conversion, someone who's very knowledgeable about history and so forth, and so I continue to reach out and to pray for him and his own spiritual journey.
That's awesome. And I think that's just a small sample of, as believers, because we struggle. A lot of us as Christians, new Christians, even the ones who've been a believer for a long time, struggle with sharing their faith with others. So I just want to, and I know you've done the investigative work, so you have sort of this knowledge that maybe others don't, but I just want you to encourage our listeners, those that are struggling with sharing their faith, why it's so important to have conversations like the one you did with Kareem, and just sitting down and having a conversation and not preaching or yelling, just being able to, like it says in 1 Peter 3, to be able to present a reason for the hope that's within you. And so why is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Is it scary? Of course it is. I once talked to Luis Palau, the great evangelist, who's probably shared the gospel with hundreds of millions of people around the planet, one of the greatest evangelists of our age. And my friend Mark and I were there, and I said, do you ever get nervous when one-on-one when you're sharing Jesus with someone? He said, every single time.
Yeah.
So here you have one of the greatest evangelists on the planet, and he always gets nervous a bit when he's in that situation. I think that's perfectly natural, and that's okay, because we know the stakes are high. We know this isn't just a casual conversation. We know that God is at work. We know that the stakes of eternity are hanging in the balance. And so there's a lot there, but it is the great adventure of the Christian life. In fact, my buddy Mark Middleberg and I wrote a book called The Unexpected Adventure, and it's 40 short readings about stories from our life and where we've kind of screwed up or not screwed up, where we've tried to share our faith. Some are funny, some are poignant, and a little spiritual encouragement each day, so that people would say, you know what, this is something I can do. I don't have to try to be like Lee Strobel. I don't have to try to be like anybody else, Luis Palau or whatever. I can be myself, and God can use me to have an impact on people in my sphere of relationships.
Yeah, it's so much about relationships and just building relationships and having conversations with people. So I can't thank you enough for that encouragement, Lee. And we're rounding up the interview. We're just about finished here. I just want to ask you our final question, and we always ask this to all of our guests on the podcast, and it's one that usually can be an easy question to ask, but it's a very difficult one for some people to answer. And it's simply this: what is God teaching you right now?
That's a great question. I almost died a few years ago. My wife found me unconscious. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor looked at me and said, "You're one step away from a coma, 2 steps away from dying."
Wow.
And I was in intensive care for quite a while. It was really touch and go, and that was a very profound experience in my life. Because what it taught me was that, and I pray this, that in my prayer life, I try to strip away all the peripheral things of life, the things that we tend to value but aren't really important. In other words, I try to come to God and learn to come to Him not as an author, not as a preacher, not as a pastor, not as an apologist, not even as a husband or a grandfather or a father, to strip away all of those things that we tend to bring into our relationship with God and get it down to the fundamental idea that I am a child of God, clothed in His righteousness, saved by His grace, resting in the arms of Heavenly Father. And so to try to get down to that has been the challenge in recent years for me. And when you come to the point of nearly dying and you realize, everything else is burned up, but ultimately it's your relationship with God that endures. And to come to Him not puffed up and full of pride about who we are, what we accomplish, or what we've done, but to strip all that away and come only as a child of God, adopted by His grace. That's been the focus of my prayer life in the last several years.
He is Lee Strobel, the author of The Case for Christ. He's also the author of more than 20 books. So you can find all of his books available online and Amazon, and certainly on his website, as well as the Case for Christ movie, just released on DVD, Blu-ray. It's on iTunes, Google Play, and was released in April in movie theaters. It's a fantastic movie with an amazing story. And I can't thank you enough, Lee Strobel, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Thank you so much.
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. God bless you and all your listeners.
And we do appreciate Lee Strobel, the author of The Case for Christ, being a guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Just such a really interesting guy, a very humble guy, a very nice guy, and it seems like a caring guy, and a guy who really just wants people to experience what he's experienced in the saving grace of Jesus Christ. So awesome to have Lee on, and that story about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a really good one. And I think it opens up the idea of conversation with people who differ in beliefs than you. We live in a social media world where, if you have a differing belief or a differing opinion, then we want to rip you. We want to crush you on social media and say, how dare you think this way, or how dare you act this way, or whatever it is. And listen, we're all human. So, most of the people who listen to this podcast, have heard of Jesus Christ and believe in Him, and that's awesome. But there are many that haven't or don't. And you know what? Let's talk. Let's have a conversation. Let's figure out, why you believe differently than I believe, why you think differently than I think. And that's okay. I think that's what Jesus would have wanted. He had conversations with people that didn't believe or differed or whatever it was. And He just wanted to have conversations. Now, He didn't compromise the truth. He didn't compromise what was in the Word of God, but He wanted to have conversation with people of differing backgrounds, of different walks of life, of different races and creeds. And He just wanted to talk to people and listen to them. And I think that's a good lesson, as Lee talked about with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for all of us to let's have more conversation. Let's just put it out there and have real conversation, face-to-face talks, and respect each other, even if we differ in what we believe. So that's my takeaway from it. And we really do appreciate Lee Strobel joining us on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And of course, we appreciate you. We thank you so much for your support, for your kind words. And as always, leave a review if you can on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. Go there and just leave a review. Let us know what you think of the podcast. Let us know what we can do better, any guest ideas that you have. But it really does help to get the word out and to get the stories out there, the inspirational stories, the stories that point people back to the love of Jesus Christ that I believe this world needs now more than ever. So leave a review on iTunes, and we truly do thank you for tuning in and checking out the Sports Spectrum podcast. And we will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast.